selfish, and I was not entirely convinced of the existence of things that were not me. And I was certain, rock solid, unshakably certain, that I was the most important thing in creation. There was nothing that was more important to me than I was. Even so, I understood what I was seeing. The Hungerbirds would, no, they were, ripping the world away, tearing it into nothing. Soon enough, there would be no world. My mother, my father, my sister, my house, my school friends, my town, my grandparents, London, the Natural History Museum, France, television, books, ancient Egypt. Because of me, all these things would be gone, and there would be nothing in their place. I did not want to die. More than that, I did not want to die as Ursula Monckton had died, beneath the rending talons and beaks of things that may not even have had legs or faces. I did not want to die at all. Understand that. But I could not let everything be destroyed when I had it in my power to stop the destruction. I let go of Letty Hempstock's hand, and I ran as fast as I could, knowing that to hesitate, even to slow down, would be to change my mind, which would be the worst thing that I could do, which would be to save my life. How far did I run? Not far, I suppose, as these things go. Letty Hempstock was shouting at me to stop, but still I ran, crossing the farmland where every blade of grass, every pebble on the lane, every willow tree and hazel hedge glowed golden, and I ran toward the darkness beyond the Hempstock land. I ran, and I hated myself for running, as I had hated myself the time I had jumped from the high board at the swimming pool. I knew there was no going back, that there was no way that this could end in anything but pain. And I knew that I was willing to exchange my life for the world. They took off into the air, the Hungerbirds, as I ran toward them, as pigeons will rise when you run at them. They wheeled and they circled, deep shadows in the dark. I stood there in the darkness, and I waited for them to descend. I waited for their beaks to tear up my chest and for them to devour my heart. I stood there for perhaps 2 heartbeats, and it felt like forever.
Your subconscious mind
It happened.
holds the key to achieve.
Something slammed into me from behind and knocked me down into the mud on the side of the lane, face first. I saw bursts of light that were not there. The ground hit my stomach and the wind was knocked out of me. A ghost memory rises here. A phantom moment. A shaky reflection in the pool of remembrance. I know how it would have felt when the scavengers took my heart. How it felt as the Hungerbird, all mouth, tore into my chest and snatched out my heart, still pumping, and devoured it to get at what was hidden inside. I know how that feels, as if it was truly a part of my life, of my death. And then the memory snips and rips sneakily, and a voice said, "Idiot, don't move, just don't." And the voice was Letty Hempstock's, and I could not have moved if I had wanted to. She was on top of me, and she was heavier than I was, and she was pushing me down face first into the grass and the wet earth, and I could see nothing. I felt them, though. I felt them crash into her. She was holding me down, making herself a barrier between me and the world. I heard Letty's voice wail in pain. I felt her shudder and twitch. There were ugly cries of triumph and hunger, and I could hear my own voice whimpering and sobbing so loud in my ears. A voice said, "This is unacceptable." It was a familiar voice, but still I could not place it or move to see who was talking. Letty was on top of me, still shaking, but as the voice spoke, she stopped moving. The voice continued, "On what authority do you harm my child?" A pause, then, "She was between us and our lawful prey. You're scavengers, eaters of offal, of rubbish, of garbage. You're cleaners. Do you think that you can harm my family?" I knew who was talking. The voice sounded like Letty's gran, like old Mrs. Hempstock. Like her, I knew, and yet so unlike. If old Mrs. Hempstock had been an empress, she might have talked like that, her voice more stilted and formal and yet more musical than the old lady voice I knew. Something wet and warm was soaking my back. No, no, lady. That was the first time I heard fear or doubt in the voice of one of the hunger birds. There are pacts, and there are laws, and there are treaties, and you have violated all of them. Silence came, and it was louder than words could have been. They had nothing to say. I felt Letty's body being rolled off mine, and I looked up to see Ginny Hempstock's sensible face. She sat on the ground on the edge of the road, and I buried my face in her bosom. She took me in one arm, and her daughter in the other. From the shadows, a hunger bird spoke, with a voice that was not a voice, and it said only, "We are sorry for your loss." Sorry? The word was spat, not said. Ginny Hempstock swayed from side to side, crooning low and wordlessly to me and to her daughter. Her arms were around me. I lifted my head and I looked back at the person speaking, my vision blurred by tears. I stared at her. It was old Mrs. Hempstock, I suppose. But it wasn't. It was Letty's gran in the same way that, she shone silver. Her hair was still long, still white, but now she stood as tall and as straight as a teenager. My eyes had become too used to the darkness, and I could not look at her face to see if it was the face I was familiar with. It was too bright. Magnesium flare bright, fireworks night bright, midday sun reflecting off a silver coin bright. I looked at her as long as I could bear to look, and then I turned my head, screwing my eyes tightly shut, unable to see anything but a pulsating afterimage. The voice that was like old Mrs. Hempstock's said, "Shall I bind you creatures in the heart of a dark star, to feel your pain in a place where every fragment of a moment lasts 1,000 years? Shall I invoke the compacts of creation and have you all removed from the list of created things so there never will have been any hunger birds, and anything that wishes to traipse from world to world can do it with impunity?" I listened for a reply, but heard nothing. Only a whimper, a mewl of pain or of frustration. "I'm done with you. I will deal with you in my own time and in my own way. For now, I must tend to the children." "Yes, lady." "Thank you, lady." "Not so fast. Nobody's going anywhere before you put all those things back like they was. There's booties missing from the sky. There's an oak tree gone and a fox. You put them all back the way they were." And then the silvery empress voice added, in a voice that was now also unmistakably old Mrs. Hempstock's, "Varmints." Somebody was humming a tune. I realized, as if from a long way away, that it was me. At the same moment that I remembered what the tune was. Girls and boys come out to play. "The moon doth shine as bright as day. Leave your supper and leave your meat, and join your playfellows in the street. Come with a whoop and come with a call. Come with a whole heart or not at all." I held on to Ginny Hempstock. She smelled like a farm and like a kitchen, like animals and like food. She smelled very real, and the realness was what I needed at that moment. I reached out a hand, tentatively touched Letty's shoulder. She did not move or respond. Ginny started speaking then, but at first I did not know if she was talking to herself, or to Letty, or to me. "They overstepped their bounds," she said. "They could have hurt you, child, and it would have meant nothing. They could have hurt this world without anything being said. It's only a world after all, and they're just sand grains in the desert world. But Letty's a Hempstock. She's outside of their dominion, my little one, and they hurted her." I looked at Letty. Her head had flopped down, hiding her face. Her eyes were closed. "Is she going to be all right?" I asked. Ginny didn't reply, just hugged us both the tighter to her bosom and rocked and crooned a wordless song. The farm and its land no longer glowed golden. I could not feel anything in the shadows watching me, not any longer. "Don't you worry," said an old voice, now familiar once more. "You're safe as houses, safer than most houses I've seen. They've gone." "They'll come back again," I said. "They want my heart." "They'd not come back to this world again for all the tea in China," said old Mrs. Hempstock. "Not that they've got any use for tea, or for China, no more than a carrion crow does." Why had I thought her dressed in silver? She wore a much-patched grey dressing gown over what had to have been a nightie, but a nightie of a kind that had not been fashionable for several hundred years. The old woman put a hand on her granddaughter's pale forehead, lifted it up, then let it go. Letty's mother shook her head. "It's over," she said. I understood it then, at the last, and felt foolish for not understanding it sooner. The girl beside me on her mother's lap at her mother's breast had given her life for mine. "They were meant to hurt me, not her," I said. "No reason they should have taken either of you," said the old lady, with a sniff. I felt guilt then, guilt beyond anything I had ever felt before. "We should get her to a hospital," I said hopefully. "We can call a doctor. Maybe they can make her better." Ginny shook her head. "Is she dead?" I asked. "Dead?" repeated the old woman in the dressing gown. She sounded offended. "Has Hif," she said, grandly aspirating each H as if that were the only way to convey the gravity of her words to me. "Has Hif an Impstock would ever do anything so common?" "She's hurt," said Ginny Hempstock, cuddling me close. "Hurt as badly as she can be hurt. She's so close to death as makes no odds if we don't do something about it, and quickly." A final hug. "Off with you now." I clambered reluctantly from her lap, and I stood up. Ginny Hempstock got to her feet, her daughter's body limp in her arms. Letty lolled and was jogged like a rag doll as her mother got up, and I stared at her, shocked beyond measure. I said, "It was my fault. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." Old Mrs. Hempstock said, "You meant well." But Ginny Hempstock said nothing at all. She walked down the lane toward the farm, and then she turned off behind the milking shed. I thought that Letty was too big to be carried, but Ginny carried her as if she weighed no more than a kitten, her head and upper body resting on Ginny's shoulder like a sleeping infant being taken upstairs to bed. Ginny carried her down that path and beside the hedge and back until we reached the pond. There were no breezes back then, and the night was perfectly still. The path was lit by moonlight and nothing more. The pond, when we got there, was just a pond. No golden, glimmering light, no magical full moon. It was black and dull, with the moon, the true moon, the quarter moon, reflected in it. I stopped at the edge of the pond, and old Mrs. Hempstock stopped beside me. But Ginny Hempstock kept walking. She staggered down into the pond until she was wading thigh-deep, her coat and skirt floating on the water as she waded, breaking the reflected moon into dozens of tiny moons that scattered and reformed around her. At the center of the pond, with the black water above her hips, she stopped. She took Letty from her shoulder, so the girl's body was supported at the head and at the knees by Ginny Hempstock's practical hands. Then slowly, so very slowly, she laid Letty down in the water. The girl's body floated on the surface of the pond. Ginny took a step back and then another, never looking away from her daughter. I heard a rushing noise, as if of an enormous wind coming toward us. Letty's body shook. There was no breeze, but now there were whitecaps on the surface of the pond. I saw waves, gentle lapping waves at first, and then bigger waves that broke and slapped at the edge of the pond. One wave crested and crashed down close to me, splashing my clothes and face. I could taste the water's wetness on my lips, and it was salt. I whispered, "I'm sorry, Letty." I should have been able to see the other side of the pond. I had seen it a few moments before, but the crashing waves had taken it away, and I could see nothing beyond Letty's floating body but the vastness of the lonely ocean and the dark. The waves grew bigger. The water began to glow in the moonlight, as it had glowed when it was in a bucket, glowed a pale, perfect blue. The black shape on the surface of the water was the body of the girl who had saved my life.
I need to squeeze your tummy.
Bony fingers rested on my shoulder. "What are you apologizing for, boy? For killing her?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "She's not dead. You didn't kill her, nor did the Hunger Birds, although they did their best to get to you through her. She's been given to her ocean. One day, in its own time, the ocean will give her back." I thought of corpses, and of skeletons with pearls for eyes. I thought of mermaids with tails that flicked when they moved, like my goldfish's tails had flicked before my goldfish had stopped moving, to lie, belly up, like Letty, on the top of the water. I said, "Will she be the same?" The old woman guffawed, as if I had said the funniest thing in the universe. "Nothing's ever the same," she said, "be it a second later or 100 years. It's always churning and roiling.
We're going to loosen up the hip.
People change as much as oceans."
To the chest.
Ginny clambered out of the water, and she stood at the water's edge beside me, her head bowed. The waves crashed and smacked and splashed and retreated. There was a distant rumble that became a louder and louder rumble. Something was coming toward us across the ocean. From miles away, from hundreds and hundreds of miles away it came, a thin white line etched in the glowing blue, and it grew as it approached. The great wave came, and the world rumbled, and I looked up as it reached us. It was taller than trees, than houses, than mind or eyes could hold or heart could follow. Only when it reached Letty Hempstock's floating body did the enormous wave crash down. I expected to be soaked, or worse, to be swept away by the angry ocean water, and I raised my arm to cover my face. There was no splash of breakers, no deafening crash, and when I lowered my arm I could see nothing but the still black water of a pond in the night, and there was nothing on the surface of the pond but a smattering of lily pads and the thoughtful, incomplete reflection of the moon. Old Mrs. Hempstock was gone too. I had thought that she was standing beside me, but only Ginny stood there, next to me, staring down silently into the dark mirror of the little pond. "Right," she said. "I'll take you home." Chapter 50. There was a Land Rover parked behind the cowshed. The doors were open and the ignition key was in the lock. I sat on the newspaper-covered passenger seat and watched Ginny Hempstock turn the key. The engine sputtered a few times before it started. I had not imagined any of the Hempstocks driving. I said, "I didn't know you had a car." "Lots of things you don't know," said Mrs. Hempstock tartly. Then she glanced at me more gently and said, "You can't know everything." She backed the Land Rover up, and it bumped its way forward across the ruts and the puddles of the back of the farmyard. There was something on my mind. "Old Mrs. Hempstock says that Letty isn't really dead," I said. "But she looks dead. I think she is actually dead." I don't think it's true, but she's not dead. Ginny looked like she was going to say something about the nature of truth, but all she said was, Letty's hurt. Very badly hurt. The ocean has taken her. Honestly, I don't know if it will ever give her back, but we can hope, can't we? Yes. I squeezed my hands into fists, and I humped as hard as I knew how. We bumped and jolted up the lane at 15 miles per hour. I said, is she really your daughter? I didn't know, I still don't know why I asked her that. Perhaps I just wanted to know more about the girl who had saved my life, who had rescued me more than once. I didn't know anything about her. More or less, said Ginny. The men Hempstocks, my brothers, they went out into the world, and they had babies who've had babies. There are Hempstock women out there in your world, and I'll wager each of them is a wonder in her own way. But only Gran and me and Letty are the pure thing. She didn't have a daddy? I asked. No. Did you have a daddy? You're all questions, aren't you? No, love. We never went in for that sort of thing. You only need men if you want to breed more men. I said, you don't have to take me home. I could stay with you. I could wait until Letty comes back from the ocean. I could work on your farm and carry stuff and learn to drive a tractor. She said no. But she said it kindly. You get on with your own life. Letty gave it to you. You just have to grow up and try and be worth it. A flash of resentment. It's hard enough being alive, trying to survive in the world and find your place in it, to do the things you need to do to get by, without wondering if the thing you just did, whatever it was worth someone having, if not died, and having given up her life. It wasn't fair. Life's not fair, said Ginny, as if I had spoken aloud. She turned into our driveway, pulled up outside the front door. I got out, and she did too. Better make it easier for you to go home, she said. Mrs. Hempstock rang the doorbell, although the door was never locked, and industriously scraped the soles of her Wellington boots on the doormat until my mother opened the door. She was dressed for bed and wearing her quilted pink dressing gown. Here he is, said Ginny, safe and sound, a soldier back from the wars. He had a lovely time at our Letty's going away party, but now it's time for this young man to get his rest. My mother looked blank, almost confused, and then the confusion was replaced by a smile, as if the world had just reconfigured itself into a form that made sense. Oh, you didn't have to bring him back, said my mother. One of us would have come and picked him up. Then she looked down at me. What do you say to Mrs. Hempstock, darling? I said it automatically. Thank you for having me. My mother said, very good, dear. Then, Letty's going away. To Australia, said Jane, to be with her father. We'll miss having this little fellow over to play, but well, we'll let you know when Letty comes back. You can come over and play then. I was getting tired. The party had been fun, although I could not remember much about it. I knew that I would not visit the Hempstock farm again though, not unless Letty was there. Australia was a long, long way away. I wondered how long it would be until she came back from Australia with her father. Years, I suppose. Australia was on the other side of the world, across the ocean. A small part of my mind remembered an alternate pattern of events and then lost it. As if I had woken from a comfortable sleep and looked around, pulled the bedclothes over me, and returned to my dream. Mrs. Hempstock got back into her ancient Land Rover, so bespattered with mud I could now see in the light above the front door that there was almost no trace of the original paintwork visible, and she backed it up, down the drive, toward the lane. My mother seemed unbothered that I had returned home in fancy dress clothes at almost 11 at night. She said, I have some bad news, dear. What's that? Ursula's had to leave. Family matters, pressing family matters. She's already left. I know how much you children liked her. I knew that I didn't like her, but I said nothing. There was now nobody sleeping in my bedroom at the top of the stairs. My mother asked if I would like my room back for a while. I said no, unsure of why I was saying no. I could not remember why I disliked Ursula Monckton so much. Indeed, I felt faintly guilty for disliking her so absolutely and so irrationally. But I had no desire to return to that bedroom, despite the little yellow hand basin just my size. And I remained in the shared bedroom until our family moved out of that house half a decade later. We children protesting. The adults, I think, just relieved that their financial difficulties were over. The house was demolished after we moved out. I would not go and see it standing empty and refused to witness the demolition. There was too much of my life bound up in those bricks and tiles, those drain pipes and walls. Years later, my sister, now an adult herself, confided in me that she believed that our mother had fired Ursula Monckton, whom she remembered so fondly as the only nice one in a sequence of grumpy childminders, because our father was having an affair with her. It was possible, I agreed. Our parents were still alive then, and I could have asked them. But I didn't. My father did not mention the events of those nights. Not then, not later. I finally made friends with my father when I entered my 20s. We had so little in common when I was a boy, and I am certain I had been a disappointment to him. He did not ask for a child with a book, off in its own world. He wanted a son who did what he had done, swam and boxed and played rugby, and drove cars at speed with abandon and joy. But that was not what he had wound up with. I did not ever go down the lane, all the way to the end. I did not think of the white miner. When I thought of the opal miner, it was in context of the two rough raw opal rocks that sat on our mantelpiece, and in my memory, he always wore a checked shirt and jeans. His face and arms were tan, not the cherry red of monoxide poisoning, and he had no bow tie. Monster, the ginger tomcat the opal miner had left us, had wandered off to be fed by other families, and although we saw him from time to time prowling the ditches and trees at the end of the lane, he would not ever come when we called. I was relieved by this, I think. He had never been our cat. We knew it, and so did he. A story only matters, I suspect, to the extent that the people in the story change. But I was 7 when all of these things happened, and I was the same person at the end of it that I was at the beginning, wasn't I? So was everyone else. They must have been. People don't change. Some things changed, though. A month or so after the events here, and 5 years before the ramshackle world I lived in was demolished and replaced by trim, squat, regular houses containing smart young people who worked in the city but lived in my town, who made me lane, all the way to the end. I did not think of the white Mini. I would not go and see it standing empty and refuse fancy dress clothes at almost 11 at night. She said, "I have some bad news, dear." What's that? Ursula's had to leave. Family matters, pressing family matters. She's already left. I know how much you children liked her. I knew that I didn't like her, but I said nothing. There was now nobody sleeping in my bedroom at the top of the stairs. My mother asked if I would like my room back for a while. I said no, unsure of why I was saying no. I could not remember why I disliked Ursula Monckton so much. Indeed, I felt faintly guilty for disliking her so absolutely and so irrationally. But I had no desire to return to that bedroom, despite the little yellow hand basin just my size. And I remained in the shared bedroom until our family moved out of that house half a decade later. We children protesting. The adults, I think, just relieved that their financial difficulties were over. The house was demolished after we moved out. I would not go and see it standing empty and refused to witness the demolition. There was too much of my life bound up in those bricks and tiles, those drain pipes and walls. Years later, my sister, now an adult herself, confided in me that she believed that our mother had fired Ursula Monckton, whom she remembered so fondly as the only nice one in a sequence of grumpy childminders, because our father was having an affair with her. It was possible, I agreed. Our parents were still alive then, and I could have asked them. But I didn't. My father did not mention the events of those nights. Not then, not later. I finally made friends with my father when I entered my 20s. We had so little in common when I was a boy, and I am certain I had been a disappointment to him. He did not ask for a child with a book, off in its own world. He wanted a son who did what he had done, swam and boxed and played rugby and drove cars at speed with abandon and joy. But that was not what he had wound up with. I did not ever go down the lane, all the way to the end. I did not think of the white Mini. When I thought of the opal miner, it was in context of the 2 rough raw opal rocks that sat on our mantelpiece, and in my memory he always wore a checked shirt and jeans. His face and arms were tan, not the cherry red of monoxide poisoning, and he had no bow tie. Monster, the ginger tomcat the opal miner had left us, had wandered off to be fed by other families, and although we saw him from time to time prowling the ditches and trees at the end of the lane, he would not ever come when we called. I was relieved by this, I think. He had never been our cat. We knew it, and so did he. A story only matters, I suspect, to the extent that the people in the story change. But I was 7 when all of these things happened, and I was the same person at the end of it that I was at the beginning, wasn't I? So was everyone else. They must have been. People don't change. Some things changed, though. A month or so after the events here, and 5 years before the ramshackle world I lived in was demolished and replaced by trim, squat, regular houses containing smart young people who worked in the city but lived in my town, who made money by moving money from place to place, but who did not build or dig or farm or weave, and 9 years before I would kiss smiling Callie Anders. I came home from school. The month was May, or perhaps early June. She was waiting by the back door, as if she knew precisely where she was and who she was looking for. A young black cat, a little larger than a kitten now, with a white splodge over one ear, and with eyes of an intense and unusual greenish blue. She followed me into the house. I fed her with an unused can of Monster's cat food, which I spooned into Monster's dusty cat bowl. My parents, who had never noticed the Ginger Tom's disappearance, did not initially notice the arrival of the new kitten cat, and by the time my father commented on her existence, she had been living with us for several weeks, exploring the garden until I came home from school, then staying near me while I read or played. At night she would wait beneath the bed until the lights were turned out. Then she would accommodate herself on the pillow beside me, grooming my hair and purring, so quietly as never to disturb my sister. I would fall asleep with my face pressed into her fur, while her deep electrical purr vibrated softly against my cheek. She had such unusual eyes. They made me think of the seaside, and so I called her Ocean, and could not have told you why. Epilogue. I sat on a dilapidated green bench beside the duck pond in the back of the red brick farmhouse, and I thought about my kitten. I only remembered that Ocean had grown into a cat, and that I had adored her for years. I wondered what had happened to her, and then I thought, it doesn't matter that I can't remember the details any longer. death happened to her. Death happens to all of us. A door opened in the farmhouse, and I heard feet on the path. Soon the old woman sat down beside me. "I brung you a cup of tea," she said, "and a cheese and tomato sandwich. You've been out here for quite a while. I thought you'd probably fallen in." "I sort of did," I told her, "and thank you." It had become dusk without my noticing, while I had been sitting there. I took the tea and sipped it, and I looked at the woman more carefully this time. I compared her to my memories of 40 years ago. I said, "You aren't Letty's mother. You're her grandmother, aren't you? You're old Mrs. Hempstock." "That's right," she said, unperturbed. "Eat your sandwich." I took a bite of my sandwich. It was good, really good. Freshly baked bread, sharp, salty cheese, the kind of tomatoes that actually taste like something. I was awash in memory, and I wanted to know what it all meant. I said, "Is it true?" and felt foolish. Of all the questions I could have asked, I had asked that. Old Mrs. Hempstock shrugged. "What you remembered? Probably, more or less. Different people remember things differently, and you'll not get any two people to remember anything the same, whether they were there or not. You stand two of you lot next to each other, and you could be continents away for all it means anything." There was another question I needed answered. I said, "Why did I come here?" She looked at me as if it were a trick question. "The funeral," she said. "You wanted to get away from everyone and be on your own. So first of all you drove back to the place you'd lived in as a boy, and when that didn't give you what you missed, you drove to the end of the lane, and you came here, like you always do." Like I always do. I drank some more tea. It was still hot and strong enough, a perfect cup of builder's tea. You could stand a spoon straight up in it, as my father always said of a cup of tea, of which he approved. "Like you always do," she repeated. "No," I said, "you're wrong. I mean, I haven't been here since Letty went to Australia, her going away party." And then I said, "Which never happened. You know what I mean. You come back sometimes," she said. "You were here once when you were 24. I remember. You had 2 young children, and you were so scared. You came here before you left this part of the world. You were what, in your 30s then? I fed you a good meal in the kitchen, and you told me about your dreams and the art you were making. I don't remember." She pushed the hair from her eyes. "It's easier that way." I sipped my tea and finished the sandwich. The mug was white, and so was the plate. The endless summer evening was coming to an end. I asked her again, "Why did I come here?" "Letty wanted you to," said somebody. The person who said that was walking around the pond, a woman in a brown coat wearing Wellington boots. I looked at her in confusion. She looked younger than I was now. I remembered her as vast, as adult, but now I saw she was only in her late 30s. I remembered her as stout, but she was buxom and attractive in an apple-cheeked sort of a way. She was still Ginny Hempstock, Letty's mother, and she looked, I was certain, just as she had looked 40-something years ago. She sat down on the bench on the other side of me, so I was flanked by Hempstock women. She said, "I think Letty just wants to know if it was worth it." "If what was worth it?" "You," said the old woman, tartly. "Letty did a very big thing for you," said Ginny. "I think she mostly wants to find out what happened next and whether it was worth everything she did. She sacrificed herself for me." "After a fashion, dear," said Ginny. "The hunger birds tore out your heart. You screamed so piteously as you died. She couldn't abide that. She had to do something." I tried to remember this. I said, "That isn't how I remember it." I thought about my heart then, wondered if there was a cold fragment of a doorway inside it still, and if it was a gift or a curse, if there was. The old lady sniffed. "Didn't I just say you'll never get any two people to remember anything the same?" she asked. "Can I talk to her? To Letty?" "She's sleeping," said Letty's mother. "She's healing. She's not talking yet." "Not until she's all done with where she is," said Letty's grandmother, gesturing, but I could not tell if she was pointing to the duck pond or to the sky. "When will that be?" "When she's good and ready," said the old woman, as her daughter said, "Soon." "Well," I said.